second session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA2, kicked off in Nairobi, Kenya on the 23rd of May 2016 with a call for concerted efforts to revitalize green economy and sustainability agenda. Hundreds of key decision makers, businessmen and representatives of intergovernmental organizations and civil society gathered at the United Nations Environmental Programme headquarters in Nairobi. It was one of the first major meetings since the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Climate Agreement. Kenya's Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Water and Natural Resources, Judy Wakungu, opened the conference that seeks to hasten progress towards attainment of environmental-related targets by 2030. The United Nations Environment Assembly, UNEA, is the world's most powerful decision-making body on the environment and responsible for tackling some of the most critical issues of our time. The Assembly holds the power to dramatically change the fate of the planet and improve the lives of everyone, impacting everything from health to national security, from the plastic in our oceans to trafficking of wildlife. Thanks to UNEA, the environment is now considered one of the world's most pressing concerns alongside other major global issues such as peace, security, finance, and health.
Achim, thank you so much for finding time to speak with us. This is a critical week, huge agenda here in Nairobi. Take us through your hopes for this critical summit.
Well, first, I think one has to explain that, this United Nations Environment Assembly, what is it? It is essentially a parliament for the environment. And from a couple of years ago, when heads of state and government called for the strengthening and upgrading of UNEP, they also wanted to have universal membership, which means that this United Nations Environment Assembly, which will now meet every 2 years here in Nairobi, Kenya, is actually a parliament of the world for the environment. All nations that are in the General Assembly are represented here. There is no other body apart from UNEA in the UN that has that membership. And its task is to help the world understand what's happening to the environment and what can we do together as nations, but also as people, as citizens, as consumers, to reverse some of the environmental damage and above all to enable development to happen in the future, sustainable development. Now, there are obviously many topics here and we'll cover them, I'm sure, in our discussions, but that in essence is the purpose, bringing all the nations of the world here to Nairobi, agree on what are the most dramatic priorities in terms of environmental damage and how they're affecting us as human beings, and then to agree actions that require nations to work together.
It's great to have this happening in Kenya, and we celebrate that, but we have many challenges to deal with. One of the key questions that keeps being asked, and I'll start off with that, how do we hold governments to account in terms of the resolutions that are made and the commitments that they make at these meetings?
That's a tough question, because I know people often look to the United Nations to be some form of enforcement or policing agency, and to be very frank with you, the principle of the United Nations is essentially a voluntary coming together of sovereign nations. So our ability to enforce and to police agreements is very limited. The greatest power, I think, that a convention, a protocol, or an agreement that is brokered by the United Nations and where countries and sovereign governments sign is actually back in their own nations. It is in the parliaments where I think citizens, through their representatives, can ask government, well, you committed our country to doing this, why is it not being done? And to be honest, the judiciary is also becoming more important. At the end of the day, when a prime minister or a government ratifies an agreement for a nation, it is the right of its citizens to ask also, why is this not being done? And if necessary, challenge it in court. So it is, in some ways, first of all, the assumption that everybody has something to gain if they agree in the United Nations to work together. That's the greatest force for moving forward. But in terms of actually enforcing an agreement, we rely on nations to honor their commitments, but we can't really go in like a police force and demand it. That's where we rely on public awareness, on citizens, on parliamentarians, and also on judges and the judiciary.
So perhaps the big question is, how much do you know about the commitments that your government is making? Are you following up on these issues? There's a lot of information out there. Perhaps it's about getting more communication on these issues out there in the public space, on the media, various different media platforms. Now, coming to the question of healthy lives, and the environment. 12.6 million lives lost as a result of either living or working in an unhealthy environment. Those are statistics from 2012. Let's talk about our region. What are the main causes for concern in the African and perhaps specifically East African region?
Well, a number of trends, and let me just contextualize this figure. These are over 12 million premature deaths, people who would not normally have died if it wasn't for an environmental quality factor, be it pollution in the air, polluted, contaminated water, an environment-related natural disaster. These are, in a sense, extraordinary numbers. It means that almost 1 in 4 citizens dies prematurely every year because of environmental impacts that we in turn have caused ourselves. And on the African continent, it will differ also on where people live. If you're in the rural areas, it may be water quality. So many children die before the age of 5 simply because of diarrhea and intestinal infections. It has to do with water quality. But also in the cities, how many children today are affected by air quality? You know, the levels of lead and sulfur, the things that we kind of smell when we're in the city and we take for granted, they actually kill people. It is things that affect our health and that we are trying to work to help countries to get rid of. For example, lead in petrol has almost disappeared, and we have worked over 25 years with countries to do so. And people in Kenya will remember, and I certainly do when I arrived in 2006 here, the sulfur content in fuels being sold at petrol stations was 10,000 parts per million. In most developed nations now it's below 50 parts per million. And because of the refinery in Mombasa, not only Kenyans, but actually much of East Africa was being sold fuel at, a level of sulfur content that was actually really causing harm. Now that the refinery has closed and new technology can come, suddenly the countries of East Africa have brought down already sulfur content first to 5,000, now to 500, and hopefully soon the fuel that anybody buys in Kenya should be of the same quality as anybody buying it in Tokyo, in New York, or anywhere else on the planet.
It's shocking because a lot of people will be sitting back going, oh my goodness, I didn't even realize there was a problem with fuel at the time. But there are things that we are aware of. And I want to focus on the citizenry for a moment and the role that we have in ensuring that we are living in a clean environment. Nairobi and many towns and cities across Kenya and in many parts of Africa, I will exempt Rwanda and maybe a few other countries, are getting dirtier and dirtier. What is the message to the citizenry on the responsibility we have alongside perhaps our county or our government structures? What must we do? What do we owe ourselves and our future generations?
Well, I would say as every Kenyan or every citizen in Nairobi or Kisumu or Mombasa, the first thing we should do is to say it doesn't have to be like this. Because we're always told that, this is how it is and we can't change it and we have other priorities. If you take a city like Nairobi, every day, probably around 2,500 tons of waste. Most of it either not being properly disposed of or being taken to Dandora waste dumps or other, illegal dumps. 80%, well over 3/4 of it, is organic waste. It could be composted, it can be turned into fertilizer, into products that can be sold again. The plastics, the metals that are there could be separated, not by the children who are currently climbing over the smoking mountains of waste in Dandora, but actually through, green jobs where you have a proper recycling facility. Hundreds of thousands of people could actually be earning a living and not killing themselves in the process. UNEP, somewhere in 2007, together with medical professionals in the university and Nairobi Hospital here, actually took blood samples of the children that are collecting and washing waste in Dandora. The levels of heavy metal contamination in their bodies went far beyond anything that the World Health Organization would even consider safe or tolerable. But this is what is happening because we are not managing waste as a resource. We are simply letting it be a problem. And why is it continuing? Well, because some people make a lot of money out of that kind of waste management. And I think it is for the citizens of Nairobi or of any city to say to their elected officials, I want you in your next time when I elect you to do something about this. UNEP has provided already studies and concepts, as have other partners to Kenya, on how to turn that Dandora waste dump into something that is no longer just an eyesore that is really affecting people, environment, and not dealing with the waste issue, but to create a waste green economy in Nairobi, where recycling becomes part of the way that people first will reduce the volume of waste, the risks it provides, and create jobs and livelihoods.
So the blueprint for transformation exists.
It exists, it has been done in many countries, but let me also be fair. I mean, what Nairobi is facing, virtually every city is or has faced, but many have overcome it. And I think it is high time that the waste management challenge is not left to those who are making a lot of money out of the current dysfunctional system. It is for government, for local government, but also for citizens to actually say, we want a different kind of quality of waste management.
The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development highlights critical links between development, the environment, human well-being, and the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, and sanitation. Progress in a range of environmental sectors has yielded improvements in health outcomes with substantial economic, financial, and social gains in the last decades. But challenges remain. In 2012, an estimated 12.6 million deaths globally were attributed to the environment. The air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink, and the ecosystems which sustain us are estimated to be responsible for 23% of all deaths worldwide. Sub-Saharan Africa, where 23% of deaths are attributed to the environment, is the only region where the burden of infectious, parasitic, and nutritional diseases is higher than that of non-communicable diseases, but non-communicable diseases are on the rise, exposing this region to both burdens. The diseases with the highest preventable disease burden from environmental risks include malaria, cancer, lower respiratory infections, and asthma, among others.
What does Paul Kagame and Rwanda teach us? Is there something we can take from our neighbor?
Well, I think certainly in Rwanda what you have seen is a very systematic assessment of what is actually the priority that we want to focus on. And then also identifying who in government or who in society should lead on it. But I think it is probably accountability. In Rwanda, when there is a decision by cabinet, it is first of all known to the public, but it's also where the president holds his ministers accountable. And then partners begin to take government policy more seriously. When something is forbidden, then you don't just ignore it. I think corruption is another issue that can get in the way of having good government policies actually be ignored. But it's leadership. I think it's leadership from the top, but it's also leadership in society. It's not just Paul Kagame who is making Rwanda become such a dynamic nation that is moving forward on so many fronts. It's an approach to development that's informed by science, that is also conscious of the fact that equity and sustainability are actually the fundamental building blocks of a development process that will have a society succeed, rather than say, well, let's have a lot of poor people, that's the price for development, or let's destroy nature because we can clean it up or restore it later. It doesn't work anymore that way, and countries and communities are paying a high price for governments or economies that continue on that pathway.
Speaking of the critical things, clean water. Let's talk about clean water for a bit. Over your period of time in this region, I think it's been 10 years now, are things improving?
They are improving in more and more places, and also with an increasing momentum. But in our work in the United Nations Environment Programme, we often have this difficulty that we look at the planet as a whole, or we look at the continent or a nation. And unfortunately, on many of the basic indicators of health of our planet or of our environment, the metrics, the numbers are still pointing downwards. We are losing habitat, we're losing biodiversity, or we're simply losing rivers and water resources. We are facing more and more pollution in the urban areas, and more people falling sick as a result of it. But we should never hide that at the same time there is an extraordinary amount of innovation happening. Governments are putting policies into place, and let's take Kenya. The renewable energy, the green energy policy that Kenya adopted 8 years ago has been a remarkable success. Imagine if all that power that is already being produced now was using coal or diesel generators, what people would pay not just in terms of cost of fuel, but in terms of their health. And Kenya's footprint in terms of global emissions would also have gone up. Instead, Kenya is now one of the leading nations on the continent in any case, and even globally, in the renewable energy economy. And new jobs are being created in copper and other such schemes where solar technology becomes accessible to a local household. Jobs are being created, and that is the kind of transition that Kenya, Morocco, Ghana, South Africa, Ethiopia, just in the renewable energy sector, are already undertaking. And at the same time, biodiversity and ecosystems. The world often looks to Africa and talks about poaching and the loss and threat to perhaps endangered species. Few people ever talk about the fact that many African countries are amongst the top leaders in the world of dedicating their territory to conservation management, which in turn enables wildlife to thrive in many parts of Africa, but also because of poaching and crime and corruption, to also be threatened again. So it's a story of both worlds or both realities.
It's a fascinating story, and particularly in a region where, while there are many who understand the importance of it, there are many others who may not understand that. We know that the human-wildlife conflict is real, and it's a difficulty in many areas. What's your message to people watching today on why we must all be part of ensuring that we are protecting, preserving, conserving?
Well, first of all, I think there would be very few Kenyans who would say we want to deliberately kill wildlife or kill the vegetation or destroy our water towers and forests. The fact that it is happening is in part a matter that many people feel they actually have no control over it, and it is others who are doing it. Or sometimes it is sheer desperation. There are many people who do not know where they're going to get the money from to educate their children next month, or even to ensure in a drought year somewhere up in the north or northwest part of Kenya, how they will make it through that drought period. So poverty, but also greed and corruption become factors that make people think, okay, the environment is not our main priority. Well, part of our task has been to work with many countries, including Kenya, but also many countries worldwide, is to say, look, your economy today, your ability to feed your people tomorrow, to generate energy, to have enough water, to have fertile soils, to have a coastal zone and wildlife and national parks that attracts tourism, depends on you managing your environment. This is your economy of today. Kenya's economy is not an industrial manufacturing economy. The Vision 2030 wants to take Kenya in that direction, but most people in Kenya today are actually dependent on the environment for their jobs. Whether it's power that comes from hydropower, whether it is, for instance, also in terms of agriculture, the water towers of the country, where the watersheds are that actually make sure that there is water in the rivers, or whether it is investment in Kenyan Forest Service, Kenyan Wildlife Service to protect environment, because few people realize that, without that wildlife, Kenya's tourism economy would be a small sector. And people would not be coming to Kenya in the hundreds of thousands and generating, billions of shillings in terms of revenues and hundreds of thousands of jobs, which in turn feed people, allow them to send their children to school, because they're actually able to earn their living through the environment. Right. And even finance and treasury and economic planners often look at an economy only in terms of the built-up environment. The infrastructure is, railways and roads and power lines and harbors. But actually, Kenya's ecological infrastructure, land, forests, coastal zones, the river basins, the wetlands, they're actually what has and will continue to keep Kenyans alive. And to protect them is not to waste money or time, it's investing in the future.
Directly tackling the interlinkages between the environment and human health can provide a common platform and multiplier effect to sustain progress across many of the Sustainable Development Goals and deliver on the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development in a more cost-effective and beneficial manner. Investments in preserving, improving, or restoring environmental quality can bring about positive interactions and be catalytic, avoiding contradictions among sector strategies and delivering multiple benefits across all goals for enhanced well-being and quality of life. Africa needs a strong basis for an inclusive economy for the future that is linked to ecosystem resilience, a healthy environment, and people's good health and well-being. We need to move from a reactive to a proactive policy approach, as many environment and health emergencies can be avoided or mitigated, preempting crises that otherwise might cripple a country's economic, political, and physical infrastructure. It is vital to put policies that involve the public and private sector, researchers, relevant stakeholders, and citizens to participate in partnerships which can foster innovation, clean technologies, innovative financing, and disseminate good practices. Africa also needs to raise awareness on major environmental and health risks and exposure, putting into place adequate communication and education strategies and policies. It is upon government at all levels and development and financial partners to scale up investments in platforms, initiatives, and programs that address the environment and health nexus to spearhead the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Let's come to way forward now. With all the challenges we have, including moving from charcoal, to more cleaner energies for cooking, protecting our water towers, our forests, there's a lot to do. Do you believe that as a region, we can change the way we think and do what we need to do, leadership and citizenry, to get things right?
Absolutely. In fact, it's already happening. And let's also be clear, Africa's starting point is in two respects far more challenged than that of other nations today on the planet. One, it is still a continent where poverty and survival and livelihoods are very often on the edge. I mean, 1 year of 2 years of bad rains and you could actually find yourself at a point where you have to kill your livestock, where you can no longer rely on your land to feed yourself. So that translates even into situations where, you remember a few years ago, we had no more water for certain days of the week because there wasn't enough water, never mind in the dams to produce hydropower. So the poverty aspect is obviously a very challenging one. And at the same time, Africa has to invest enormously in its infrastructure development. So resources are very scarce. But I would say when UNEP introduced the concept of moving towards a green economy, and we have also prepared with the Ministry of Environment here a kind of blueprint for Kenya's transition towards a green economy, not starting from zero, but moving further and faster on ensuring that in the process of development you don't destroy the very capital that you have, the wealth of nature that is here. And many African leaders in government but also in business have actually embraced this work in the African Union when heads of state and government meet, but also in the African Ministers' Conference on the Environment. There are many countries who have requested UNEP's advice and assistance to think about the future in terms of a green economy. And I think even if you go back to Kenya here, people often underestimate how many pieces of legislation have already been put in place to try and help the country protect its citizens and its environment. Even things like that people may complain about. Why should we, not import 15-year-old cars from Japan or somewhere else? Well, basically because they're inefficient, they're very polluting, and Kenyan citizens are actually better protected by not letting those who can afford to buy a car to buy some dirty, polluting car. If you can afford to buy a car, then try to at least buy one that has closer to state-of-the-art technology, because otherwise the air quality in Nairobi will continue to deteriorate. And I mentioned to you before the interview that we have just installed 7 air quality monitoring stations around Nairobi together with the ministry. It's a new development of technology that UNEP has done that will one day allow us to have in every neighborhood, in every school, one of these devices to measure air quality, to know how seriously we are being affected by it.
That's so critical and really good to know. We'll be keeping an eye on that. Achim, it's been 10 years, I think, in Nairobi now for you, and you are exiting in June. We will be sorry to see you go. What are your thoughts as you leave Kenya, and what are your hopes for the country?
Well, my first thought is one of gratitude. My family and I, we have spent 10 very happy years here. We felt part of the community, and we, as I think most people who come to Kenya and then live here, learn to love this nation with all its beauty, but also its dynamism, its entrepreneurialism. Kenya is an extraordinary nation. Public debate, political debate, business people, and people really get things moving here and start with innovation to take ideas that other countries may take much longer. So it's a very dynamic environment in which to live. Obviously, being the head of an international organization that has its headquarters here, I sensed at the beginning of my tenure that many always thought that people are trying to take UNEP away from Kenya. I think the only reason why UNEP would ever be moved out of Kenya is if Kenyans themselves do not maintain the political and economic vision that allows this nation to thrive. We have lived through some very tough moments here, the elections in 2007, Westgate, and many other moments. But I have seen, sadly, many difficult moments later in many countries. Kenya has proven to be extraordinarily resilient, and my only wish is that, in this vibrant political culture, people can find the wisdom to focus more on what they agree on and not always make what they disagree on the center of the political debate. It's in every nation, every community, and every family, the basic recipe for living together. And my hope is that for the rest of my life and that of my family, we will be regular visitors here and see UNEP and the UN thrive in Kenya, as it has done for more than 4 decades now.
What a lovely message. I'm just going to reiterate that to the politicians. The message is focus on what you agree on and less on what we disagree on. And that way we can build the nation. And it's up to us to ensure that the fundamentals are in place and we're moving this nation forward. Huge assembly. What do you hope to achieve when the assembly closes?
2 things perhaps are particularly important this week here. One is that this is now a Universal Assembly, and that the United Nations as a whole system, the General Assembly, recognizes that every 2 years in Nairobi, the world's environment capital, as I always say, the environmental agenda is being set. This is the authority on environment, and that environment is development, and therefore it must be noted also in capitals around the world. Secondly, that we help governments to come together and address issues. And there are many things here today that are being looked at. Sand and dust storms in parts of the world are becoming a real problem, shutting down entire cities, schools that are closed for a week in Iran and in many parts around the Middle East, but also other parts of the world. We need to help the world and nations to come together and address them. Microplastics in oceans. In a few years' time, people estimate that there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish. Now, is this really the way we want to go, or can we start doing something? And we need to do it as nation states, implementing the Paris Climate Agreement. We're living through a strange period of weather and rainfalls here in Kenya. Natural disasters are already causing havoc across the world. This may be an El Niño specific phenomenon, but we know that climate change is going to affect every Kenyan, every African, every citizen across the globe. It is here in UNEP that we take decisions on how to promote cleaner energy, different kinds of land use and ecosystem-based adaptation, as we call it. Protecting our wetlands, our mangroves, our forests. This is our insurance against the consequences of climate change. And finally, that I think countries will leave from here feeling that by working together, they can achieve more quickly. That is the basic idea of multilateralism. That's why the UN was founded, that we learn to help one another because we are actually better off on all fronts as a result of it. It may sound a little abstract, but very basic things can very quickly translate into practical outcomes. Take the illegal trade in wildlife. Without the cooperation of the rest of the world, how much longer will Kenya have elephants or rhinos on its land? It needs the world to work together, because the environmental syndicates, or the environmental criminals, so to speak, the syndicates out there, are working together very effectively in this globalized economy. Right. They're literally well over $100 billion being made from the illegal trade in wildlife products. $100 billion, which again finance weapons and conflict. And that is where I think UNEA needs to be a voice for the environment and why it is important to the future of African economies, communities all over the world. And what we also do very well is to recognize that science is an important part of helping us to understand what's happening around us. And just now we are beginning to all get concerned about the Zika virus. It has begun to arrive on the African continent.
Brazil, I believe, is where you were born.
I was born in Brazil, and indeed to see these tragic pictures of many Brazilian mothers discovering that they had the virus and having their children born, with the consequences of having carried that virus, often not even knowing about it. Our sister agency, the World Health Organization, but the whole UN system right now is very focused on how will we deal with this phenomenon. And it is something that's called a zoonotic disease, diseases that take animals as a vector in order to then reach humans.
Right.
Few people know that today 60% of all infectious diseases, Ebola, SARS, bird flu, Zika, are actually zoonotic diseases. They take a carrier in the animal kingdom and then reach us as humans. And in part, that is also a consequence of environmental change. So health and environment is the theme of this week at the United Nations Environment Assembly. And on an example like this, very dramatically illustrated.
It's great to hear that science is an integral part of all of this. And all this happening, ladies and gentlemen, in Kenya. The question I then ask is, can Kenya take the lead in terms of conservation? Can we be a country that kind of sets the example? We can only achieve this if you and I, alongside government, take part, participate, be aware. Let's do this. Thank you so much, Achim, for making time.
Thank you very much.
What a pleasure.
It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you.